Hi, Mickey.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing fine.
Well, I'm not.
Actually, I'm not doing fine. Why do I keep saying I'm doing fine? I'm all wet. I've been out in the rain.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
You don't know
You
what
could
I've gone
catch your
through.
death of a cold, Mickey.
The pressure of touring is getting to me. I think I may have to break up the band.
Yeah, but then no groupies.
There are no groupies anyway.
So you're traveling, and that takes it out of a man. Plus, I've been on a retreat, and you've been on a retreat, and ironically enough, we've each been on retreats with institutions we're affiliated with, and ironically enough, at the end of a retreat, you always feel as if you need a retreat. They exhaust you and leave you brain dead.
I was on the Slate retreat. What retreat were you on?
I was on the New America Foundation retreat.
Oh,
but,
Jesus.
Mickey, one thing that's interesting is that I was actually invited to the Slate retreat, but couldn't go because of the New America Foundation retreat. So what that would mean is that I was actually invited to 2 retreats, and you were only invited to 1 retreat.
Well,
I'm not saying that reflects on our worth as human beings or anything. I'm just not saying it doesn't, and I'm just throwing it out there for people to do with as they will.
The New American Foundation thinks I'm too old and insufficiently solution-oriented, so I wear their failure to invite me as a badge of honor.
Okay.
Plus, the constant pressure to come up with new ideas must be grueling.
Yeah, but that's what we generate there, and when we put out several an hour at a retreat, and I am charged with generating, I would say 90 to 95% of those. So you can understand my exhaustion.
Did you actually get in a hot tub with Ted Halstead?
I don't recall that part, but there's a lot of things at retreats that you don't remember, and who knows? I don't think so, though, no.
Okay, well, maybe they had the
thanks
hot
for
tub
putting
party
that thought
and
into my
didn't invite
head. Yeah, I know. You're talking about an old Washington Post story, right?
He's famous for getting into a hot tub with somebody. I don't know who.
No, it was that there was this Washington Post piece about how it was about him and his apartment. He had a hot tub in his apartment.
Okay, well,
but
I suppose he's not a force for evil.
I don't think so. Some of us associate with those, and some of us don't. But we'll get to that later.
Oh dear. Okay.
So, what's on the nation's radar screen, Mickey?
Well, the Coast scandal, the Daily Coast,
the alleged scandal.
I don't want to call it a scandal. I call it controversy. Made it into the mainstream media.
Yeah.
There was a piece on in the op-ed page of the New York Times by David Brooks, and there was another MSN piece somewhere else. But basically, the lay of the land is still the same.
You led me to the David Brooks piece, and I actually think I have found a very consequential factual error in that that he may find himself having to correct.
Okay, well let me lay out
in public. So set the.
I'll set the table here, and then you can clean it out.
Okay.
The lay of the land is still the same. Coase's partner, Jerome Armstrong, was revealed to have signed a consent decree to SEC charges that he touted as stock in exchange for secret payments. He neither admitted he didn't admit wrongdoing. He agreed not to talk about it. The amount of the fine, if any, and there may be none, is still apparently under negotiation.
Right,
but that was sort of a revelation.
No connection with Coase except by kind of metaphor or something.
Well, there are several implications. One, if he touts stocks for money, maybe he touts candidates for money. It happens to be illegal in business. It's everyday politics in politics. The second shows that he may have had a sort of get-rich mentality from the start. He may be less of an idealist than we thought. But the other, and the third is he selling access to Coase as part of what he charges as a consultant? In other words, you want to hire me because I'm good. I'll convince my good buddy Marcos Melitsas to endorse your candidate and send the Coase legions your way. And he has endorsed a couple of candidates, and then Coase has praised him. There are also legitimate explanations for why Coase has seemingly switched allegiances at these key moments, but they're suspicious. The 2 other developments are, one, the astrology angle. It's discovered that Armstrong posted for an astrology website, in fact, seemed to apply astrology to the political fortunes of various candidates.
He does what? I hadn't heard about this.
Well, that's because you're not on top of it the way I am, Bob.
True.
He had before he might he had he wrote for an astrology website where he sort of seemingly seriously applies astrology to various problems. And there's a hilarious one that the New Republic's Plank links to, where he seems to imply the political meaning of the discovery of some new moon, I think it is. Anyway, so that raises...
And you don't think new moons have any relevance to these matters?
Well, they may, but that's out of my field of expertise. But the point is, they're two points of relevancy.
So Armstrong's past is increasingly turning out to be a little embarrassing. That much is established.
Well, there's the problem. If he believes in this stuff, why should we trust him for anything else? And there's the problem. There's the interesting point of, was he a true believer or was he conning people with this astrology website too? I tend to think from talking to friends, he was a true believer, because apparently I hear rumors that before this he was a Zen Buddhist. That may or may not be true, but that implies the mentality of a true believer, not a con man.
Okay.
And the second thing is that all this stuff is covered most intensely in the Rogers Cadenhead website. He's become the go-to site for all matters Cozola. There's some question of whether he raised money for a PAC that wasn't dispersed to candidates, but was in fact went to the preservation and maintenance of the left-wing blogosphere. And did that involve basically paying money to other bloggers that people thought was contributing to candidates? I should say the amounts of money are very, very small if you look at it. So that does not seem to be such a big deal. But that's
your voice is getting increasingly small, and I'm having increasing trouble hearing it. So if there's anything you can do about that, but maybe there's not.
How about this? Is it better?
That was much better.
Okay,
wow.
There you go.
Talk
Subtle
about
adjustment
that I would have encouraged from the very beginning of this dialogue.
Okay.
So can I unveil my major?
Go ahead.
My finding about David Brooks. I hope it's original. I haven't checked Technorati to see if anybody has unearthed what does seem to be something that David Brooks may have to correct, and arguably even libelous about Daily Kos. Okay. It's this David Brooks column about the Kos controversy. And it's not, it's funny, Mickey, you had a blog item about Kos's response to the David Brooks item, and you chided Kos for not explicitly responding to the Brooks analysis. Well, for one thing, it's not really much of an analysis. I mean, there's so little in the way of damning goods that Brooks, rather than lay out some kind of argument that Kos has done a lot of grievous things, he, adopts this like one of his tiresome literary conceits. In this case, it's that Kos thinks he's God. Actually, it changes. At one point, he thinks he's God. At one point, he thinks he's Jesus, and so on.
Right,
anyway, so there's actually, and he just kind of the name of the piece is "Respect Must Be Paid," I think, and
how did he libel him?
What's that?
How did he libel him?
Well, okay. I mean, there's only, when I read it, I only highlighted one paragraph, because there was only one paragraph that was actually significant information in this whole David Brooks column that was potentially damning. And it's the following paragraph. And you have to know all the literary conceits to understand this. Okay, Kos is the kingpin in this paragraph. Mm-hmm. Cossack cultists are his supporters. And respect is a euphemism for money being paid to Armstrong, and that being the one thing that will get Kos's attention in the Brooks worldview. Okay, here's the paragraph. When Sherrod Brown, the Democratic Senate candidate in Ohio, hired Armstrong last year to help with his campaign, this was also a sign of respect. The kingpin had instructed his Cossack cultists to support Brown's Democratic primary rival, Paul Hackett. But the kingpin switched sides and backed Brown over his former anointee. Now, it's pretty clear what that's saying. It's saying before the money was paid, Kaus had instructed his followers to back Brown's rival, and then he changed his tune, right?
Well, he did change his tune. We just don't know when the money was paid.
Well, no, there's a timeline online at the National Review, which you would not expect to the National Review, the corner, the blog TTS by Jim Garrity.
Right.
And you would not expect a pro-Kos bias at that particular place. And according to this, it's actually quite clear. The arrangement, it was in April 2005 that Sherrod Brown hired Armstrong, okay?
Right.
And started paying money that month. it was October 4th, months later, that Sherrod Brown begins making noises about making his potential Senate run official. Okay.
Right.
So he wasn't even running at the time the money was paid. And then he says, Coase responds, and then he has Coase supporting the rival to Brown. Okay.
Right.
So, this was an attempt to be a comprehensive timeline, and I'm sure he was looking for the first time Coase endorsed the rival to Brown, and the first instance of it is months after the payments are made. And then it's true, he does change his mind, but what David Brooks says, again, is when Sherrod Brown, the Democratic Senate candidate in Ohio, hired Armstrong last year to help with his campaign, this was also a sign of respect. The kingpin had instructed his Cossack. That clearly means he had rendered this instruction before the money was paid to support Brown's Democratic primary rival. That seems to be factually and very consequentially wrong.
He doesn't say before the money is paid. You say he implied.
What?
He doesn't say before the money is paid. You're adding that.
He implies it in the sense of logical implication. There is only it's not ambiguous. There's only one way to read these two sentences, and that's that he had paid the money. Mickey, listen again. The word "had" is key. When Sherrod Brown hired Armstrong, this was also a sign of respect. The kingpin had instructed his Cossack cultists. There's only one way to interpret had instructed. That's that he had done it before the money was paid. We need a correction from the New York Times, and possibly an apology, since this is, if true, if untrue is, I don't know my law. But
well, we don't quite know if it's untrue, but if it is untrue, it is damaging and inaccurate. But it seems like he has some wiggle room there. I think your interpretation that it 100% implies that he changed his mind, when the money was paid to his buddy Armstrong is not 100%, it's 90%.
I would love to hear you actually make the case that this paragraph could possibly be interpreted by a sentient person as meaning that he had not done this before the payment was made. But we'll leave that.
It's going to be interpreted by lawyers.
And we'll let the Times, what is it, their ombudsman or whatever they call it, decide. But it does seem that David Brooks got something very consequentially wrong. It's the only fact in the whole piece that's actually substantively damning, and it's wrong.
Well, the coincidence is damning, even if you got the precise timeline wrong, even if Armstrong had been hired all along.
No wait. I mean, I'm sorry, but if months after the money was paid to Armstrong, Coase is endorsing the rival.
I don't understand.
That is a much less damning thing.
Bob,
this would clearly be a more damning set of events if it were as David Brooks has depicted it.
Bob, if I say hire me, I'm buddies with Tom DeLay. They hire me, and 3 months later I convince Tom DeLay to change his mind. That is washed in corruption as usual, and that's all people are really accusing him of. It doesn't really matter that the exact moment in which I am paid doesn't really matter.
That, it's like Siamese twins. So the idea that Coase would not have known for months and months and months that Armstrong was working for this guy is not very credible. And in any event, it's clearly the case.
They're two different charges.
In either case, the evidence is circumstantial in either case. There's no smoking gun in either case. But it is a more suggestively damning set of events if it's as David Brooks presented
I guess than
if it's as it in fact actually happened, apparently, to judge by this new National Review
Bob,
timeline.
I can't penetrate your carapace of verbiage.
What?
I'm having trouble getting a foothold in this conversation.
Because my logic is so overwhelming.
There are two different charges. One is that Coase said, as soon as you pay Armstrong, I will endorse you. Okay, you're right that Brooks sort of implies that, and it's not at all clear he got that right. Okay, and that's an extra bit of charge. The second charge, which is just that Armstrong, one of the things Armstrong is selling is that access to Coase doesn't depend on when Armstrong got paid. So there are two different charges that we've now refined that and.
So if Brooks is right, there are two scenarios in which corruption happened, and if he's wrong, there's only one. So his being wrong narrows the range of possible damning scenarios.
That is correct.
Do you agree with me?
That is correct. If he's wrong, I'd love to see the discovery in that case, because we'll find out a whole bunch of stuff.
So you agree? Good.
But I agree what? I agree that if he got it wrong, he's added an unwarranted element of negativity, yes.
He has made the facts, which are in either event only circumstantially damning, seem more damning, more broadly damning than they in fact are.
But in general, I thought Brooks's column was sufficiently badly written that it might serve to inoculate Coase as opposed to spread the contagion of scandal.
I mean, his comedic tone is so over the hill.
It would have been better if he'd. He makes a point, but it would have been better if he'd played it straight, I think.
Well, we will link to the Brooks piece and to the timeline.
And we'll also link to Roger's Cadenhead and to Dan Reel, who has the stuff on this penny ante blog pack scandal.
Okay, need we talk more about Coase? I mean, we could, but
I could go on and on, but I won't.
Okay, I mean, the one thing I would say, not at the risk of starting another argument, is just that by your standards, I mean, you were arguing that yes, Coase, there is something shady about him saying nice things when his friend even is about someone from whom his friend is receiving money. Well, if that's the case, Mickey, you on your blog, it seems to me, should not opine about anyone who's ever given money to any of your friends, which means you should never talk about the media at all, the mainstream media, because all of them have given money to some of your friends, and so on. So I just think it's crazy.
That's very attenuated, Bob. The point is that these alleged reformers are slipping into corruption as usual in Washington. Yes, there's corruption in everyday life. We all suck up to people who can do things for us, etc. We're not always completely sincere and authentic, but it gets worse and worse. And the point is, it's very easy to slide into, and they seem positively eager to slide into it. That's the problem.
Well,
it's one for their followers and for Mark Warner, who's being damaged by this whole thing, to decide what to do. It's not a legal matter, I don't think.
Well, I just made an argument that if what they're doing is corruption, then what you do is corruption, and maybe what all of us do is corruption, and rather than actually address the argument I made, you just reasserted that it's corruption. So we can continue
I just said
next
some
time
of it's worse than others.
What?
If we could never say something about a friend of ours somebody who's paid money to a friend of ours, all life would be paralyzed.
That's kind of my point. You're defining corruption with absurd breadth.
No, you could say that people shouldn't sell access to candidates to political activists. That's a perfectly clear rule you could draw, and you could say this is too much.
What is too much? For him to talk about someone from whom a friend of his received money is too much? Is that what you're saying?
For him to flip endorsements in the direction of his friend who's a paid campaign consultant. That's different than me talking about a newspaper that happens to employ a friend of mine. Jesus.
No, it's not.
You have no sense of perspective.
So wait, so you're saying there is a certain intentionality that distinguishes the two on the part of the paying party, or on the part of the friend who's the intermediary?
Yes, the friend who's the intermediary.
Okay, but that's I mean, those are the two things that have not been established.
Right, but that's standard political business. You don't think Mark Warner knew when he hired Jerome Armstrong that he was buddies with Coase and might swing Coase his way?
That bit of intentionality,
none of my friends who work on papers say,
is not hard to grant.
None of my friends who work on papers say, hey, New York Times hired me because I know Mickey Couse, and maybe he'll say nice things about the New York Times.
Okay.
That's just not on the radar.
Okay, so
it's a question of degree that turns into a qualitative difference.
So what should Coase do when somebody pays money to a friend of his? So it has to be a candidate.
His friend, he should make it clear to the world that his friend doesn't tell him what to think, that his friend has no special access. A few conspicuous disagreements wouldn't hurt.
Well, okay, but that's corrupting right there. If you're saying he should criticize the candidates for the sake of showing that he's independent,
I'm not saying that, Bob.
That's just as corrupting of the truth of his actual belief as the alternative.
I'm not saying he should gratuitously.
Oh, well, what was your phrase again?
I said it wouldn't hurt.
Oh, it wouldn't
some
hurt.
evidence that he was independent-minded.
You just noted that it wouldn't hurt.
Yes, that's what I said, Bob.
Yeah. Okay.
But,
I'm sorry, I misinterpreted you.
yes, you did. I think I'll sue you,
Yeah,
as long as
good.
we're in a libelous mood. But luckily nobody's watching this. Anyway, he could make it clear that Armstrong shouldn't be selling access to him, and Armstrong shouldn't get into situations where he seems to be selling access. And COSA supporters should rise up and say, we're not sure. It's not all about COSA or Armstrong, and we're taking our movement back from these two guys.
Well, maybe you're saying COSA should just cease to be Armstrong's friend because he has no control over who Armstrong accepts money from.
I'm not.
And refusing to be people's friends on grounds of their morality is a discussion we've had before.
I think he has. I think he has a lot of influence with Armstrong.
A lot of what?
Influence with Armstrong. That's what I'm told.
COSA has influence with Armstrong?
Friends have a lot of influence with their friends, and COSA has a lot of influence with Armstrong. If he could tell Armstrong to find a different line of work, or to work,
Oh, come on. Oh, well,
to work in
maybe
a
you're right. Maybe Armstrong
area.
is his manservant. I don't think so, but maybe you're right.
The point is, anyway, we could beat this to death. Let's move on.
Let's move on. Let's move on to Iraq.
Okay.
Weapons of mass destruction?
Weapons of mass
I haven't
destruction.
read any of these pieces because I was on a retreat. And did they even appear in like the New York Times and stuff, or just like the Washington Times?
It was on page A10 in the Washington Post, and there was a Walter Pincus article pissing on it. Basically, what happened is there was a press conference last week by two Republicans, Rick Santorum and Peter Hoekstra, if that's how you pronounce it. They got the government to declassify parts of a report that said they discovered in 2s and 3s 500 shells with chemical weapons in Iraq that Saddam had not destroyed as promised, and the right-wing press sort of took this as a cue to say, there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Others said, they were old weapons, they couldn't have been used by terrorists anyway. They're really nothing to worry about, but at the very least they seem to imply that Saddam did have a lot of weapons that he maybe didn't account for scrupulously to the international authorities.
Okay.
And it was played up in a minor way by the mainstream media, which becomes another bone of contention on the right. They say, hey, you're downplaying our story.
But we don't do that on Blogging Heads TV. We're addressing it.
We beat it to death.
Well, it seems to me, there are two questions that could be affected by this potentially. One is, does it affect the rationale for going to war? Because, one big gripe has been, look, turns out there weren't any WMDs. That undermines the rationale for the war. And the other one is, did the administration mislead us, whether consciously or unconsciously? Okay. As for the first one, would these weapons have been grounds for going to war? I would say not only would a 12-year-old stockpile of fairly small in the scheme of things, stockpile of chemical weapons not have been grounds for going to war, this whole category of weapons would not have been. Chemical weapons, as I think now most arms control experts agree, should really not be called weapons of mass destruction. There just is at least an order of magnitude difference in terms of how much damage they can do. There's just nothing like nuclear weapons or biological weapons.
Wasn't what happened at Halabja a chemical weapon, and wasn't that pretty widespread?
Well, if you
death and
control the
destruction?
skies of your country and can flood a town with your helicopters, you can do a certain amount of damage with chemical weapons. Then again, you could do it with regular missiles. You could do it with machine gun, helicopter-mounted machine guns. If you've got control of the skies and helicopters, there's a lot of ways to kill that many people. But as for its efficacy as a terrorist weapon, somebody sneaking it into America and using it, there are several problems. A, it's in Iraq, it's big, it's bulky. B, it's 12 years old, probably doesn't work. But C, just chemical weapons generically, you just in terms of when you look at how they're deployed and so on, there's no way you wind up killing like 1 million people or 500,000 or realistically 100,000, whereas biological weapons can kill 1 million, 2, 3 million. Nukes can kill 1 million, 2, 3 million. A plausible chemical weapons attack, you might get into the realm of several thousand. You might. But if somebody wants to kill several thousand people, they're better off just starting here in America and buying fertilizer and stuff. It's much, much easier. There's no way that is the practical way for terrorists to kill a few thousand Americans.
But you're sort of moving... that all makes sense to me, okay? But you're sort of moving the goalposts. I mean, before the war, it was clear that chemical weapons were defined as a weapon of mass destruction.
Well, no, a lot of us... I mean, a number of people are saying they shouldn't be.
But that was what everybody thought.
Well, there's a lot of mind warp going on. I mean, when you look at what we, it's ever more amazing to look at what the national state of the national consciousness was. I mean, for example, if you look at the extreme case of what was being alleged about what Saddam Hussein had, okay, nobody was claiming he had a nuke, actually had one. They were saying he had a program. And nobody was claiming that he had a biological weapon that A, was contagious, and B, that we didn't have a vaccine for. That's a true biological weapon of mass destruction. But the things that were being talked about were like anthrax, which is not contagious. It's actually, anthrax is the equivalent of the most deadly possible chemical weapon. It's the equivalent of a time-release chemical weapon, but it's not contagious. And then anything else they were talking about, we had a vaccine for. So
if we discovered huge stockpiles of anthrax, that wouldn't have been a cause for going to war either?
Much better one than what they've discovered, but I would, well, it wouldn't be in my lights, because I thought they might have that, and I was against the war. Anthrax is very hard to deploy given the current technology. It's hard to, aerosolizing it, I think is the term, is still a great technological challenge. Certainly for anybody who would be doing terrorism.
Surely if they discovered large stockpiles of anthrax, that would bolster the case for having gone to war.
For going to war?
Yes, for having gone to war, in retrospect.
Well, bolster in the sense of making the case stronger than it was if they didn't have it, yeah.
Yes. But you say that this one doesn't even move the needle at all.
No, because because no rational terrorist would say, who wants to do the most damage you could do with these weapons, would choose to do it using these weapons. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. It seems to move the needle a tiny, tiny bit, but I agree not much.
And then the second question is, did the administration mislead us? I mean, if anybody on the right is saying, well, now you can no longer say the administration misled us, well, yeah, we can. I mean, they told us he had an active nuclear weapons program. They repeatedly used the word program. They didn't say he has some residual chemical weapons. They talked about programs. They talked about mobile bioweapons labs. And by the way, I'll link to it in the Washington Post a couple of days. There was more evidence of that. It was brought to the administration's attention what nonsense that claim was, which Colin Powell made in his speech. Before he made the speech, a CIA agent who was charged with vetting the speech apparently crossed out the paragraph, and it was steaded. And I'll link to that Washington Post piece.
I thought we knew that before. Anyway, I don't disagree with you when you've had so much caffeine that I'm loath to disagree with you anyway.
I also had some chocolate, so I definitely would not recommend disagreeing with me. Do I sound vibrant? Do I sound good?
You sound great. I'm guzzling Coke as fast as I can to try to get up to your energy levels, but it's not working. The second thing that happened in Iraq is that Maliki, the head of the government who was elected, unveiled his reconciliation plan, which involved some vague, watered-down form of amnesty and some vague form of, which I think is different, of respect for resistance groups as distinguished from militia, bizarrely. And those are two very, very controversial issues. Of course, the U.S. Senate, especially among Democrats, is posturing ridiculously, saying, "How dare you grant amnesty about people who have not only killed American soldiers but attacked but broader anyone? How dare you give amnesty to people who have attacked American soldiers?" I say, we're friends with a whole lot of Japanese who attacked American soldiers in World War II. You can't make peace with if you're going to make peace, you have to make peace with the people who are shooting at you. And there is a culpable claim that if a foreign power invades your country, this seems to be the interesting question: when are you entitled to shoot back? If they claim to have UN authorization, do you have to roll over and surrender? Do you have to say, well, I recognize some UN authorization and not others? What's your responsibility as a citizen of the world? It seems to me that some Iraqis, they were invaded by America and they shot back. So it's time to make peace with them.
Yeah, you may have to refresh me on a little of what you said because I was dealing with the lighting issue. But on the first thing you said on this amnesty issue,
Yeah.
you were saying it's a watered-down version of amnesty. I mean, it's not clear that that's the way they intended. That's the way the New York Times played it. That the proposal coming from the Prime Minister's office doesn't include the kind of amnesty that was intended. But first of all, I mean, the idea all along, I only realized for the first time, was that it wasn't just that you would grant amnesty to people who had killed Americans. It's that that's the only kind of killing you would grant amnesty for, right? You would not grant amnesty to anybody who killed Iraqis.
Civilians, I think.
Civilians. Okay.
I don't know about, I don't know about
here's anyway. The other interpretations were that this proposal does leave room for amnesty for those who killed Americans, and here's what I think is a significant confirmation of that interpretation. There was a story on today's New York Times website that'll be in tomorrow's paper, presumably, saying that an official in the Prime Minister's party had said that insurgent groups are showing interest in the proposal and inquiring about it. Now, that may all be spin. That may or may not be true. But, interestingly, he said that of these groups, they are not implicated in the bloodletting of Iraqis. Okay? So that seems to imply that his understanding is that to qualify, these groups just have to have not killed Iraqis. And this sounds like any kind of Iraqis. I don't know, but certainly...
I think it's a Geneva-like distinction between soldiers and civilians, but I may be wrong.
Yeah. So I think they are thinking, that killing Americans will leave you eligible for amnesty. Killing Americans alone. I can see why American politicians would have trouble explaining that to Americans, but I'd still be in favor of it if it did the trick.
But there were 19 Republicans who voted against opposing this sort of amnesty, and for that they were ridiculed on the Huffington Post. So the Democrats are being quite opportunistic on this issue when Republicans try
we agreed on that last
to
time.
slow the brakes, right? But
I haven't changed my mind.
But there's a second part of this proposal that bothered Iraq the model, which is that it seems to give some sort of honor to the resistance that it doesn't give to the militias, bizarrely, some sort of legitimacy. And he's actually very disturbed by this.
It gives legitimacy to what?
To the Sunni resistance. That somehow it implies that it was a legitimate act of national honor to resist the Americans in a way that it's not legitimate to be part of the Sadrist army or the Ba'ath
that was
brigade.
countering the.
Sorry.
I see. Well, why? I mean, to the extent that the Sadrist army just killed Americans, they'd be okay, right?
We're not talking about amnesty. We're talking about some sort of form of honor. And he wants to dismantle the militias, but somehow he said that resistance was legitimate, and this really upsets Iraq the model because he argues, how can you say we're the legitimate government? We want the Americans to stay to enforce the legitimate government, but it was legitimate to resist us. I guess I think he got a little overexcited. I assume what Maliki is saying is, okay, now we have a legitimate government. Before maybe we didn't, but we've had elections. I'm it. Now's the time to lay down your arms. Before it was legitimate, now it's not. It seems to me he has an argument to make. I thought it was very interesting that Iraq, the model, was upset by other parts of this reconciliation agreement. He's normally a guy who would give it the benefit of every doubt.
Yeah. Well, and certainly seems to me the premise he's arguing with there is almost implied by the idea of amnesty for Americans. But anyway, I mean, the other thing I wonder is at this point, how many, now that enough of a civil war has unfolded, certainly a lot of ethnic cleansing, how many insurgent groups can there be who don't have Iraqi blood on their hands? There was a time when the insurgents who had much Iraqi blood on their hands anyway were primarily foreigners, maybe, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But I just can't believe that after the last few months, there are really virtually any insurgent groups.
Obviously, this is going to be fudged and finessed, and they're going to give amnesty to a whole bunch of people who have, in fact, participated in the killing of Iraqis and the killings of Americans, and they couldn't prove it in a court of law, so what are they going to do? It's not going to be done by individual trials. It's some sort of political process, but that's the best we can hope for. I mean, You know, so
let them fudge away. I think they will have to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's all a question of fudging. You admit that was a hopeful sign. And what really annoyed me was Spencer Ackerman of the New Republic saying, well, if Maliki pulls this off, it will be a defeat for Bush. And he can call it victory if he wants. Well, it is victory, and Ackerman's just showing that he's a...
Why would it be a defeat?
I don't know. Ackerman linked to some seemingly irrelevant speech by Bush where he said, well, if we leave, because they're uniting on the basis of their opposition to Americans, and they want a timetable for withdrawal, and he linked to a speech where Bush said, well, if we leave before they can defend themselves and sustain themselves, then it'll be defeat. Well, Maliki's not obviously arguing that we should leave before he can sustain himself. So the quote Ackerman linked to didn't prove his case. He just doesn't like Bush, and he wants to portray everything as a defeat for Bush, even when it would be a huge victory.
I have exactly the same impulse, but I do draw the line somewhere.
Well, good. I'm glad. That's why I associate with you, because I don't associate with disreputable people.
I can't think of any examples of you doing that. But more on that later, Mickey, when we get to viewer email.
Okay.
There's a viewer who's paying attention to the social scene in Southern California lately, Mickey.
Okay. I'll start thinking about my response.
Okay, you better.
But I think we have to go to Israel first, don't we?
Yeah, and you'd like to stay there.
We'll spend a long time in Israel.
One of the few people.
One of my favorite topics, as you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just that, we've reached another level of depressingness in Israel. Some Palestinians dug this tunnel to the edge of the Gaza Strip to a military outpost that Israel was manning, and killed, I think, 2 soldiers, but abducted 1, more consequentially. And at last check, Israel was making noises about something that almost was being depicted in some places almost as a re-invasion of Gaza. I kind of tend to think that won't happen because, as somebody pointed out, there's just about, even if they know where the guy is, it's very hard to imagine them getting him out alive. It's very hard to imagine the Palestinians not killing him as the Israelis are closing in. Israel in the past has attached great significance to retrieving abducted Israelis. They've been willing to trade large numbers of Palestinian prisoners to get Israelis back, and that's presumably why they abducted this guy. And that's the good news for the guy. It's not like being abducted by insurgents in Iraq. I mean, when they abducted those 2 American soldiers in Iraq, I didn't have much hope for them.
I assume that this was an attempt by Hamas to further undermine Abbas, because Abbas has sort of stolen a march on them with this plebiscite that he proposed. So this is their way of seizing back momentum and undermining it further.
The connection of Hamas to this is unclear. I mean, I think the group that took responsibility is an offshoot of Hamas or something. I think one report said one of the guys involved in it, presumably one of the guys who was killed, they killed 2 Palestinians, was from Hamas or something. There was an former Israeli official quoted in the, it was the New York Times, the Jerusalem Post, as saying that he thought that it was ordered by the foreign wing of Hamas, the Hamas exiles, and that the Hamas prime minister did not even know about it. And there was further speculation that actually the people behind it, and this could be compatible, it could be the same people, the Hamas's foreign wing, were trying to disrupt possible rapprochement between Abbas and Hamas, because they were about to get together to meet on this so-called prisoners proposal. This is a number of Palestinian prisoners, including Hamas members initially, had put forth this plan that involved the 2-state solution, and Abbas and Hamas were about to meet to discuss that. That was derailed by this attack, and some people speculate that was it's all pretty hazy in terms of who did this.
Well, but so it's the same thing as usual. The terrorists disrupting, promising moves, and Israel doing what the terrorists want by derailing the promising moves.
Well, no, this is an old story that the terrorists who who don't want meaningful negotiations to happen between Palestinians and Israel do something, and they get the hoped-for response by Israel. They haven't gotten it in this case yet, by the way. I mean, Israel hasn't invaded or anything, but it's happened a lot under both Sharon and I would say Olmert already, although he hasn't been prime minister for very long. And it gets back, to a point that I made last time, which is, in my view, both Olmert and Sharon actually don't want a coherent voice to emerge on the Palestinian side. I don't think they want all-out chaos, but they are apparently, according to a Newsweek survey, they are arming one side in what could become a civil war. They're actually, I guess, in the process of giving guns to Fatah, which they would use to kill people in Hamas. And there's enough people in Hamas that would not be like a policing operation. Okay, that would be, I think, fueling a civil war. And can I say one more thing about that claim of mine that these particular Israeli leaders have been kind of encouraging a certain degree of chaos and incoherence on the Palestinian side?
Heaven knows I have nothing to contribute to this analysis, so go ahead.
Okay, well, this is my claim that I should be in symbolic possession of the moose at this point. I mean, I think the way we should do this is, we got a complaint that we had not been deploying the moose, that is violating taboos, saying things...
Get your own moose. You can get them at the toy store, just go get it. Who's stopping you?
That's not a response to the issue I was going to raise.
But you can symbolically raise the moose.
Mickey, I'm not complaining about the fact that the moose is actually in your apartment, okay?
Okay.
You can keep the moose itself, Mickey.
Okay,
and
go ahead.
do with it as you will.
I may have misinterpreted
I'm not going to say anything further about that.
Okay, I may have misinterpreted what you're saying. Go ahead.
We got this email saying we had quit deploying the moose. That is violating taboos. Saying things that nobody's willing to say.
Okay, now
I was saying, well, maybe we should deploy the moose every week. But then I thought, no, that would be the end of our careers. So maybe what we should do instead is there's always one of us in symbolic possession of the moose who has deployed it most recently, and then it's the other person's turn to deploy it, and the other person should feel a sense of inadequacy until he regains symbolic possession of the moose.
Okay, so go ahead, destroy your career. Good, I'm waiting.
No, I'm not going to say anything I haven't said, except that what I had already said should qualify as deploying the moose for the following reason. It so happened that I found myself in conversations with two friends of mine who, in recent years, have covered the Middle East for major publications you've definitely heard of. I tried this theory out on both of them. I said, don't you think that both Sharon and Olmert were actually trying to keep a coherent voice from emerging on the Palestinian side, even as they claimed they wanted a partner for dialogue in the form of Abbas or whoever? And they both said, of course. And I said to one of them, so when Bush says to Olmert, I want you to try for 10 months to engage and to find a way to have dialogue, and then you can impose a unilateral border solution. Surely, then do you think Bush knows that it's all a charade? Bush knows this isn't going to happen, and he said, I don't see how Bush could possibly be so naive as to not realize that.
No,
this is something that insiders know, but I don't think either of these had ever written it. So it's something that people in the know, but nobody's willing to say, I get the moose.
Well, I assume Bush thought he might be able to pressure Olmert into doing something he didn't want to do. That's usually how we get the Israelis to do something they don't want to do, is by pressuring them.
When was the last time Bush got the Israelis to do something meaningful that they didn't want to do?
His father did, apparently.
His father was a very different Bush in this regard. Very early on, when Sharon, after the war, when Sharon was seemingly making progress toward peace, apparently my dovish Israeli friends were very happy with the pressure Bush was applying. It quickly went away, but there was a period when he seemed to be following through. There was a period right after the Iraq invasion where, because the idea of the Iraq invasion had been this is going to help things in Israel, and there was a little, you're right, there was a little bit of an effort.
And then they owe us,
to follow through.
Yeah.
But anyway, I get the moose, right?
Yeah, I expected an analytic point about Israel, not about the moose, but go ahead, I'll settle for that.
No, I've given up on Israel. I just want the moose.
I don't think
it is getting really, really, really depressing, and credit goes to the New York Times for making this the lead piece, I guess, today. I mean, by and large, the media it's just so important because, this is Al-Qaeda's #1 talking point. It's not something Osama bin Laden ever actually cared much about, the fate of the Palestinians, but we've seen in their literature, when we've gotten a hold of private letters and so on, that this is the Israeli issue is always listed as one of the top two recruiting points.
But here's the question: if there was a two-state solution and there was a Palestinian state living in peace and harmony with Israel, obviously that would still be considered an excrescence of the Arab heartland by many people. So it's not going to completely stop the Arab terrorists.
No, they might still make the claim, but it's a lot harder to do if you create a situation when the Palestinians themselves are happy with the situation, which I admit gets less likely every day as we just let the cycle get ratcheted up. I grow less hopeful every day, but it would certainly undermine the rhetorical appeal to some extent of the terrorist recruiters, and they have described this themselves as their best, as one of their top two talking points.
Okay. Well, we spent many minutes on something to which I added absolutely nothing, so let's move on.
You were a valuable part of the Moose discussion.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're to viewer email now.
Okay. I may have technical difficulties at some point, but we'll see.
I think I know when.
Go ahead.
This is from David F., who, first of all, makes a kind of an interesting point about whether someone would feign belief in the afterlife, a leader, or exaggerate belief in the afterlife, if this leader had, like, nuclear weapons, to enhance his or her kind of power and to seem, I guess, to seem less deterrable was the argument. Anyway, it was an interesting argument.
Except if you seem...
The P.S., did you want to say something?
If you seem undeterrable, doesn't that encourage a first strike?
Well, that's what I was going to ask.
It
actually gets nuanced in the actual game theory of nuclear war, where something we discovered during the Cold War is that actually you want stability. There are certain kinds of ambiguity you don't want to encourage. So
Right.
it would depend on the circumstances. But if what would be the case? The case would be if they had nukes, Iran had nukes, Iran wanted to invade some country with a conventional force, and they wanted the people with the nukes to think that if they shot a nuke, Iran would indeed... No, wait. Oh, anyway. I'll work it out for the next episode.
It is an interesting point, though. But
it is an interesting point, but the P.S. is the key.
Yeah.
Apparently, this is the person who nominated, David F. nominated the slogan, "We retort, you decide," which indeed went on our T-shirts, and, of course, now it's gotten to the point where you just can't walk on a subway car without seeing somebody wearing one. I mean, they're everywhere. I'm surprised the guy's not asking for royalties. What he does say is, and it's never too late to send a personalized thank you note for my submitting "We retort, you decide."
I would send that thank you note before he sues.
What's that? Well, I don't know. I would focus on the phrase "it's never too late." If it's never too late, then we can put it off longer.
Oh,
right?
good point. Okay,
because it'll never be too late.
Well, let's put it off.
So let's put it off. But didn't we say that whoever won the slogan contest, and it turns out there are a couple of winners, would get an autographed copy of your book, The End of Equality?
We may have. I'm happy to do that.
Okay, so if this person emails you, they get that.
Okay. Fair enough.
Okay. Here's an email. We got some good, substantively challenging emails here. One challenge is your point. We were talking about Somalia, and you said, and the parallels or lack thereof with the Cold War. You said, and this was a case where Islamists had taken over part of Somalia. You were saying, well, at least that was more conducive to commerce than in the Cold War when leftists would take over countries, and we would lose in the sense of losing a proxy state, but further, the leftists would, destroy the economy, which I guess maybe was good once it was in the hands of a Soviet client state. But anyway,
well, it was easier
you
to
said
get
that
out.
was a distinction, and that Islamic governance would be more conducive to commercial thriving. And this person, did you read this email? Points out.
I read the email. It was a very good email, and I don't have the expertise to respond to it. He said, look, when the Taliban ruled Afghanistan, it was the poorest country on earth, and if all these Arab states didn't have oil, they would be failed economies too. I guess my just instinct is that they for all their rules against high interest rates and usury.
Well, it's interest at all, yeah.
They do allow for a market tradition and a business tradition to continue, and that has to be better than state control. But I could be wrong. It's an interesting question.
Certainly there are Islamic countries that permit interest rates and so on. I mean, but I guess he's saying if it's the hardcore and they impose strict Sharia, he's saying money it's illegal to loan money. Half of the workforce is excluded, that is women and so on. So it may be a good point. I mean, ironically, Islam during its period of expansion and for a while near global dominance, a millennium or so ago, was actually commercially extremely successful by the standards of the day.
I guess that's what I was thinking of. But that was a very good email to get.
It was. Here's another one substantively challenging me. This is somebody, Connor F. Oh, the other person is Aaron W., who wrote in that other good email, the previous one. Connor F. says, although he's more conservative than me on the war on terror, he's to my right, he says, I'm convinced by your mantra that not gratuitously pissing people off is an important part of this struggle. In other words, the growing lethality of hatred, as I've been known to put it. But where do I draw the line? He says, when I talk about Danish cartoons, blah, 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 I say we shouldn't do these things because they make people angry at us, easing terrorist recruitment. Okay, but where do you draw the line? How do you decide when something that will piss them off is worth eschewing, and so on? And brings up, the cultural issue, our domestic television advertising features half-naked women, various things that would annoy conservative, fundamentalist Muslims. Our domestic television advertising features half-naked women. Gay rights are increasingly protected. Gay pride parades are held in big cities. Women walk around unveiled. Jews hold prominent positions in our society. I presume you don't want formal or informal measures taken to change those things. None of those things quite, I guess. I mean, half-naked women, I wouldn't mind me if the public display of certain things were subject to more moral suasion, not legal. But a good example of something that I definitely advocate more moral firepower being directed toward than was, and I think you agree with me on this, and actually independently reach the same conclusion. The Janet Jackson Super Bowl incident was an act of stylized male sexual aggression. Leave the nudity alone, which I'm also not wild about, speaking as someone who watches TV with, young children, children who were younger than they are now. But that was an act celebrating rape, basically, if you really looked at it. And that should have been condemned much more broadly than it was. Should have been condemned by feminists, and you didn't hear much of that because people on the left think, if you condemn anything on moral grounds, then you're playing into the hands of censors. I think it's the opposite. It's sturdy moral sanctions prevent the need for censorship. But anyway, you probably agree, right?
I agree, but that doesn't answer the reader's question of where you draw the line. I was assuming you had some principled.
It's the beginning of a response to the reader. But I would say
it's the beginning of a beginning.
It's the beginning of a beginning. Well, but I would say it's legitimate to bring into our criteria of moral evaluation of things. Well, no, I'm not going to put it that way. No, you're right. It's not even close to being an answer. But the next email is actually in a related theme. Alan R. asked me a similar question in the context of Ann Coulter. I say she's a threat to national security, because if she, uses ethnic slurs toward Muslims, and I guess I said this. He said, he quotes her line, "We should invade them, kill their leaders, and convert them to Christianity." I guess I also said if it gets around that a mainstream or a commentator who's considered legitimate by American culture is saying things like that or using ethnic slurs, that's a recruiting point for terrorists. He says, well, what about Michael Moore, people like Michael Moore who go around saying that President Bush began the Iraq War in order to seize Iraq's oil or enrich his friends in the oil business? Isn't that a talking point for terrorists? I'm definitely not a Michael Moore fan. I would say that when I feel strongly about this is in cases where, as with the example cited in the case of Ann Coulter, there's just kind of no... what she's saying is either completely gratuitous, like an ethnic slur, or it's an assertion about a proposal that is just nobody really takes seriously. Invade them, kill their leaders, and convert them to Christianity. So that's gratuitous in its own way. I would say certainly those things should be discouraged by moral sanction. Now, Michael Moore, you know, the idea that securing Iraq's oil supply was being taken seriously in non-nutty circles. I mean, outside of Michael Moore, you even, I think there was a version of this you even talked about. So I'm not sure that quite meets my criteria.
Well, I don't understand. You want to condemn Ann Coulter because she says things that nobody takes seriously, and you don't want to condemn Michael Moore. You don't want to condemn Michael Moore because people actually take him seriously, and his ideas about us seizing the oil have impact.
Well, no, I'm assuming, first of all, in either case, the things would be depicted as meant seriously by the terrorist recruiters, okay? But what I'm proposing, when I'm proposing any constraint, and I'm never proposing legal constraint on what Ann Coulter says, but when I'm saying that people should shun her socially, say, what I'm proposing is a moral inhibition of speech. And I think we should be very careful about the speech we do that to. So I think when it's just gratuitous, it's like not a meaningful expression of a serious proposal or anything. That's when it's okay to do it. That's what I'm saying.
Well, it is an expression of a serious proposal. She thinks Islam isn't the religion of peace, and it divides things into a house of Islam and a house of war, and that's a legitimate point of view.
None of that is what I mentioned. I didn't mention that. So that's not what I'm talking about.
You're talking about this pathetic little ethnic slur that you're blowing up into like an epic libel when it's really not.
Actually, she said more things like that a reader emailed in, and I'll get to those. But I guess I also am. You know, also we should invade them, kill their leaders. I mean, that's kind of nutty. Yeah. But yeah, I do take ethnic slurs seriously. I plead guilty.
Old news. Go ahead.
Now, Mickey, we seem to, on this Ann Coulter thing, we seem to have lost two viewers. First one because of me, and the second one because of you. Austin W. writes, bye, it's been great. Be back when Bob gets his head out of his blank and his fingers out of his ears. Sheesh. And it's because, as he puts it, Ann Coulter was, quote, banned. You know, I said I wouldn't have her on Blogging Heads TV.
Right.
I mean, let's not make this sound like a First Amendment issue. Mickey, we were both at the New Republic when Mike Kinsley was editor. We both know there were people who, if you had said, why don't you have so-and-so do a piece and appear in our magazine, you would have said, no way. I mean, that's what you do when you run a forum like a magazine or a TV show or whatever. So there's actually people, other than Ann Coulter, that you're not going to see on Blogging Heads TV who haven't done anything that I consider really vile, which she has.
Maybe you should post a list.
Now, the second viewer we lost because of you.
I think if you posted a list of people you won't have on TV, that would cause controversy and get us viewers.
Huh, that's a fascinating idea.
It's an idea I picked up from Ann Coulter.
Osama bin Laden, for starters. No way.
Okay.
I'm not even answering his emails. Okay, this email from Beth C. I'm turning Blogging Heads off. And this is in the context of Coulter. Kaus has gone off the extremist deep end here. Blah, blah, blah. My mind is effing blown away that Bob Wright, whom I loved in the Meaning of Life TV stuff, by the way, that's meaningoflife.tv is the URL, which is still out there, is not just wasting his and our time, but doing harm by engaging Kaus, sorry. Seriously, makes me wonder who is paying Kaus. Do you have any reply to that, Mickey?
I'm sorry, I missed the first half of that because my earpiece fell out, but it sounds like she's saying not only I shouldn't associate with Ann Coulter, but nobody should associate with anybody who associates with Ann Coulter.
Correct. That's known as a meta-sanction in the theory of like moral evolution. I'm asking you to apply moral sanctions to Ann Coulter, and she's asking me to apply a meta-sanction to you, and I'll give that some thought.
Well, I think you should if it's as serious, if this ethnic slur was as epic and world historic as you say. How can you talk to me?
Although it's accepted that in the real world there is a distinction in the severity, so that that the way morality works, there are things that sanctions are applied for and are recommended for and are urged for by people like me, and yet meta-sanctions are not applied. But look, Mickey, I'll give it some thought. This may be the last you hear.
Well, maybe the solution is you just have to be surly and over-caffeinated whenever you interact with me.
Am I that? Do I seem like that right now?
No, not surly.
Over-caffeinated or just caffeinated?
Caffeinated. Not yet. The night is young, though. Actually,
I was recovering from this retreat. Oh, man, the night's not young. I'll speed it up. Okay.
Well, let's just do one more and...
Okay, it's just this Ann Coulter... Okay, one more. Person writes, well, no, two more. I promised, first of all, I promised I would elaborate on things she has said other than that. She said, quote, and recently, this is in February, in a column, the offense to Islam ruse is merely an excuse for Muslims to revert to their default mode, rioting and setting things on fire. She's saying that's the default mode of Muslims generically, Mickey. Now, if somebody said poverty is just an excuse for blacks to revert to their default mode, dealing drugs and shooting people or whatever, would you say that's racist?
Did she say poverty was just a excuse?
No, it's a different thing she's saying, Mick. She
well,
says,
but I think you're adding an element of appropriate.
no,
by saying
she's
that
saying
poverty.
she's saying it's an explanation for their behavior, as poverty is an explanation for the behavior of some blacks. Okay.
And what was provoking this behavior?
She's calling it the offense to Islam ruse, the claim that the cartoon has offended them, okay? But the key phrase goes after, I'll read the whole thing, but the key phrase is at the end. The, quote, offense to Islam, unquote, ruse is merely an excuse for Muslims to revert to their default mode, rioting and setting things on fire. She says that's the default mode of Muslims generically. Is that or not analogous to racism, except being applied to a religious group?
A, they do seem to riot and set things on fire a lot, more so than in other countries. And B, it's an obvious point of political rhetoric. I mean, she dated a Muslim. She's not making a slur against all Muslims.
And some of her best friends are Jewish, and so on. I mean,
the point is, if that's the best you got, you're in bad shape.
Really? So what would you say if somebody said poverty is just an excuse for blacks to revert to their default mode? You would say that's not racist?
I wouldn't say that, but that's a different thing. If she said poverty is an excuse for
no, I didn't say would you say it. I would say if somebody said it, would you say it's racist? If they said blacks generically default mode is to deal drugs and shoot people, is that racist?
If you said if you offended their religion and they had a history of rioting and setting things on fire, I would say it's not racist.
Oh, Muslims have a history of rioting and setting things on fire? Like through Muslim history, you've looked into this? And Mickey, there are 1.2 million Muslims. Do you have any idea how many have been involved in a riot or set anything on fire?
Well, yes, but except that they were pretty big riots, I think, some of them. And she's making a political point, Bob. It's not.
Well, Mickey, whites and blacks and Christians have been involved in riots of significant magnitude at various times in history. Did that mean that was their default mode?
It does seem that there have been, the Koran has desecrated their riots, the cartoons, their riots. There are a lot of riots.
Well, there were a number of riots by blacks in the 60s. So are you saying the same thing about them? That's their default mode?
Saying that the default mode of Arabs, when offended, is to riot when there have been riots over cartoons is not a racist thing. It's pointing out that they were rioting over mere cartoons.
She said it about Muslims generically, including the 1.1999 whatever billion who didn't riot.
Well, she didn't say they were all rioting. This is a pointless discussion. Let's. What else?
It is.
What else?
Because you're just being incredibly stubborn. It is amazing. It is mind-boggling.
What other strained analogy to racism are you going to make?
Well, here's one. She also said, or is NATO like the conventions of civilized behavior? Actually, this could be defended, maybe. But anyway, this is what she said. I mean, it couldn't be defended, but it maybe is not as bad as that. Or is NATO like the conventions of civilized behavior, personal hygiene and grooming, blah, blah, inapplicable when Muslims are involved, end quote. So she's saying conventions of civilized behavior, personal hygiene and grooming are inapplicable when Muslims are involved. She could say, I guess, that what she means is people refrain from demanding them when Muslims are involved. Not that Muslims never demonstrate them. She could conceivably weasel out of that one.
Yes.
But anyway, the other thing I promised is somebody writes in, I guess this is a Scott, maybe. I'm not sure what the name is. How about some full disclosure on why Mickey Kaus constantly defends Ann Coulter? Links to a blog item titled, Why Won't Ann Coulter Leave L.A., in which is reported that you recently escorted her to a party, and it's an account of that party.
Well, I said she was a friend of mine, and I took her to this party for Kathy Sipes' lovely daughter Maya, who was graduating from college. We were mainly conservatives there. And she was at home and charmed everybody, and everybody liked her.
Right.
Except for Matt Welch, who didn't talk to her because he said he wouldn't talk to Eichmann. So.
Oh, so you read the blog item?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Yeah, he did say that.
Big deal.
True.
But
let me just
anyway,
end on a positive note. I'm sorry about all the rancor I've stirred up, Mickey.
But no, that's okay. That's part of your shaming process, we decided.
I know. It's keeping America morally strong. From Jonathan, it just occurred to me while watching the World Cup coverage, Blogging Heads TV is an almost perfect analogy to soccer at its highest level, an engaging, cerebral, and addicting enterprise unfortunately consigned, so far, to a niche presence in the culture of American discourse. Bob, watching you and Mickey is like watching Brazil if Brazil were allowed to play itself. He did not say play with itself, although that analogy has also been made by others. There's a similar analogy. Free-flowing and deft wordplay leading to breathtaking insights and scored intellectual points with the occasional spectacular say, by the moose. It goes on and on. One thing I'm wondering is now that we do read a number of your emails, do you think it's going to get to where people, such as Jonathan, just to hear their first names start writing suck-uppy emails the way with on America's Funniest Home Videos, people started staging accidents?
It could be, you know, a poisonous feedback loop that destroys the authenticity of our emails. But let's assume that one was sincere and untainted by desire for celebrity. But we're in penalty time if we're like soccer.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. It's my fault. I'm sorry about the caffeine.
I
was compensating for the brain death that ensued after the retreat. And
you had to get to Ann Coulter, didn't you? It was just... You just
Caffeine
couldn't leave
does that to me,
without doing that.
which is more than it takes in your case, I would say.
What was that last crack?
I said caffeine does that to me, which is more than it takes in your case.
Now I'm drinking caffeine. What are you talking about?
I'm glad to hear that you missed you missed my implication there.
I did. I missed the
Don't
implication.
watch the videotape. Whatever you do.
When I rewatch, right, I'll catch the implication and I'll be mortified.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll claim that the earpiece fell out of my ear again.
It's plausible. Happens.
Cool.
Okay, we're still friends, right?
I don't know. We'll see.
Okay.
See if I show up again. It's making a cliffhanger. It's like a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye.